The year was 2147, and humanity had finally reached the stars. For decades, Earth's brightest minds had worked tirelessly to build Aurora's Reach, a sleek, state-of-the-art exploration vessel designed to venture beyond the solar system. Its mission: to seek out new worlds, alien life, and answers to questions that had haunted humanity for centuries. But no one aboard could have predicted what they would find near a dying star. Captain Elias Venn stood on the bridge of the ship, staring at the view screen as it displayed an object drifting silently in the void. It wasn't natural. Its shape was too precise, its surface shimmering faintly with iridescent hues. The crew buzzed with excitement and unease. Was this their first contact with intelligent life, or something else entirely? "It's not responding to any hails," said Lieutenant Rourke, the ship's security officer, his voice tight with suspicion. "No signs of power or movement." "Could be derelict," suggested Dr. Neera Patel, the xenobiologist, adjusting her glasses nervously. Her dark eyes sparkled with curiosity despite her apprehension. "But we won't know unless we go inside." Elias nodded. He trusted his instincts, which told him this discovery was important, even if it made his stomach churn with dread. "Prepare a team," he ordered. "We're going in." Minutes later, Elias led a small group through the airlock of the alien craft. The interior was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of unseen machinery. The walls were smooth and metallic, etched with strange symbols that glowed softly under their helmet lights. The air smelled stale, like dust and decay, but breathable enough for them to remove their helmets. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Ensign Carter, the youngest member of the team. His wide eyes darted around nervously as he clutched his scanner. "Stay focused," Elias replied sharply. "We don't know what we're dealing with here." As they moved deeper into the ship, the corridors grew narrower and darker. Strange noises echoed around them, soft clicks and whirs that seemed almost alive. Then, without warning, something moved in the shadows ahead. Everyone froze, weapons raised. A figure stepped into the light. It was humanoid but clearly not human. Her skin was translucent, glowing faintly with an inner light. Long flowing hair framed her delicate face, and her large, luminous eyes brimmed with sorrow. She wore tattered robes that shimmered like liquid silver. For a moment, no one spoke. The alien woman simply stared at them, her expression unreadable. Then she lunged forward, grabbing Elias by the arms. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she sobbed uncontrollably, speaking in a language none of them understood. Her grip was surprisingly strong, yet desperate, as though she feared letting go. "What do we do?" whispered Carter, his voice trembling. Elias hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to pull away, but something about her stopped him. There was raw pain in her touch, a depth of emotion that transcended words. Slowly, he placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her. "It's okay," he said softly, though he doubted she understood. "We're here. We'll help you." The woman clung to him tighter, burying her face against his chest. Her sobs echoed through the corridor, filling the silence with a heart-wrenching intensity. Whatever had happened to her, and whoever she was, she carried a burden far heavier than anyone could imagine. For now, all Elias knew was that this mysterious encounter had changed everything. And deep down, he sensed that her tears held secrets that might alter the course of humanity forever. Back aboard the Aurora's Reach, the alien woman, whom Dr. Patel had tentatively named Leora, was placed in a secure observation chamber. The room was designed to monitor potential threats, but it also served as a temporary refuge for anything, or anyone, too mysterious to immediately understand. Leora sat on the floor, her glowing skin dimming slightly as if reflecting her exhaustion. Her wide eyes darted around the sterile white walls, taking in every detail of her new surroundings. She didn't resist when the crew guided her there, but her posture spoke volumes. She was wary, fragile, and deeply afraid. Captain Elias Venn stood outside the chamber, watching her through the reinforced glass. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? Where did she come from? And why had she clung to him so desperately? He couldn't shake the feeling that her tears carried more weight than just personal grief. There was something urgent about her presence, something he couldn't quite put into words. "She's not hostile," Dr. Paddle said, breaking the silence. She held a tablet displaying data collected during their initial scans. "Her vitals are stable, though her physiology is unlike anything we've ever seen. Her body emits low levels of bioluminescence, almost like communication." Communication. Elias frowned. "You think she's trying to talk to us?" "It's possible," Paddle replied, adjusting her glasses nervously. "But without understanding her language, or even how her vocal cords work, we're stuck guessing." Elias turned back to Leora. She was staring at him now, her luminous eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. For a moment, he felt as though she could see straight through him, reading his thoughts, his fears, his doubts. Then she raised a trembling hand and pressed it against the glass, her lips moving silently. "What's she saying?" Carter asked, peering over Elias's shoulder. The young ensign looked both fascinated and terrified. "I don't know," Elias admitted, "but we need to figure it out." Over the next few hours, the crew worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between human and alien. They tried everything. Translation algorithms, visual aids, even mimicking basic gestures, but nothing seemed to work. Frustration mounted as each attempt ended in failure. Lieutenant Rourke, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, voiced what many were thinking. "This is pointless," he muttered. "We don't even know if she understands us. What if this is all some kind of trick?" "A trick?" Patel snapped, glaring at him. "She's scared, Lieutenant. Can't you see that? Whatever happened to her, it wasn't good." Rourke shrugged. "Fear doesn't always mean innocence." Elias ignored the argument. Instead, he focused on Leora. Something about her demeanor reminded him of a lost child, alone, confused, and desperate for help. He decided to try something different. Stepping closer to the glass, he knelt down so he was eye level with her. Slowly, he placed his hand where hers rested on the other side. "I don't know who you are," he said softly, "or where you came from. But I promise we'll do everything we can to help you." For a moment, Leora simply stared at him. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she closed her eyes and tilted her head back. A faint hum filled the air, resonating deep within the chamber. It wasn't a sound they heard with their ears. It was more like a vibration, a pulse that echoed in their bones. Images began flashing in Elias's mind. Vast cities bathed in golden light, towering trees with crystalline leaves, skies painted in hues no human artist could replicate. And then, destruction. Fire. Screams. Darkness. Elias gasped, stumbling backward as the vision faded. The others rushed to his side, concern etched on their faces. "Captain, are you all right?" Patel asked. "What happened?" Carter demanded. Elias shook his head, struggling to process what he'd just experienced. "She showed me something. Her world. It was beautiful, but then it burned." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Leora watched them intently, her expression softening as if relieved that someone finally understood. "That's impossible," Rourke scoffed. "How could she?" "It doesn't matter how," Elias interrupted, his voice firm. "What matters is that she's trying to tell us something important. We need to listen." From that moment on, the crew redoubled their efforts to communicate with Leora. Though progress remained slow, one thing became clear. She wasn't just a survivor of tragedy. She was a messenger. And whatever message she carried, it was meant for humanity. As the days passed, Captain Elias Venn found himself spending more time in the observation chamber with Leora. The alien woman had begun to trust him, or at least tolerate his presence, enough to share fragments of her story through vivid mental images. These visions were disjointed, like pieces of a shattered mirror, but they painted a haunting picture of a world lost to catastrophe. One evening, as the rest of the crew worked tirelessly in the lab to decode her language, Elias sat cross-legged on the floor outside the chamber. Lyora mirrored his posture inside, her glowing skin dimming and brightening rhythmically, almost as if she were breathing light. She reached out her hand again, pressing it against the glass. This time, when Elias placed his palm against hers, the connection was immediate and overwhelming. Images flooded his mind so vividly that he felt as though he'd been transported to another place entirely. He saw rolling fields of shimmering grass that sparkled under twin suns. Towering crystalline structures rose into the sky, their surfaces refracting rainbows of color. Strange creatures with feather-like appendages flitted between trees whose branches glowed softly in the twilight. It was breathtaking, a paradise unlike anything humanity had ever imagined. But then the scene shifted. The skies darkened, and the ground trembled violently. Explosions erupted across the horizon, sending plumes of fire and ash into the air. The once pristine cities crumbled into ruin, their crystalline spires shattering like glass. Screams filled the air, not just human screams, but sounds that pierced Elias's soul, cries of anguish from beings he couldn't comprehend. Children ran through the chaos, their translucent forms flickering like dying flames. And above it all loomed something vast and incomprehensible, a shadowy entity that seemed to consume everything it touched. Elias gasped, pulling his hand away as the vision faded. His heart pounded in his chest, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Lyora watched him silently, her expression heavy with sorrow. Her eyes glistened with unused tears, and for the first time, Elias understood why she clung to him so desperately. She wasn't just mourning her home. She was warning him. "Captain," Dr. Patel's voice startled him. She stood nearby, holding a tablet filled with data. "Are you all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," Elias replied, though his voice shook slightly. "She showed me her world. It was beautiful, but then it burned. Whatever destroyed it, it wasn't natural." Patel frowned, stepping closer. "Do you think it was an attack? Or some kind of accident?" "I don't know," Elias admitted. "But whatever it wasn't random. That thing, the one I saw, it felt alive, like it hunted them." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Lyora's people had been wiped out by an intelligent force, then humanity might not be alone in the universe. But they also weren't safe. The thought sent a chill down everyone's spines. Later that night, Elias gathered the senior crew members in the briefing room to discuss what he'd learned. Using rough sketches and descriptions, he tried to convey the enormity of what Lyora had shown him. Ensign Carter listened intently, his young face pale with awe. Lieutenant Rourke, however, remained skeptical. "So let me get this straight," Rourke said, leaning back in his chair. "You're telling us this alien somehow projected memories into your brain, showing you her dead planet and some big bad monster that destroyed it. Sounds like science fiction to me." "It's not fiction," Elias shot back, his patience wearing thin. "I felt it, Rourke. I saw it. And if we ignore her warning, we could end up just like her people. And how do we even know she's telling the truth?" Rourke countered. "For all we know, she could be leading us into a trap." Dr. Patel stepped in before the argument escalated. "We can't rule out any possibilities yet, but whether she's a victim or a threat, one thing is clear: she knows something important, something that could affect all of us." Elias nodded, grateful for Patel's support. "Exactly. We need to keep working with her to understand what happened to her world and why she's here. Because if there's even a chance that danger is heading our way, we have to prepare." The meeting ended without resolution, leaving tensions simmering among the crew. But Elias didn't care about their doubts or fears. All he could think about was Lyora's haunted gaze and the weight of the burden she carried. She had survived the destruction of her civilization, only to find herself stranded aboard a human ship, trying to warn strangers who barely understood her. That night, Elias returned to the observation chamber. Lyora was sitting quietly, her hands resting in her lap. When she saw him, she tilted her head slightly, as if asking if he believed her now. He knelt beside the glass once more, meeting her gaze. "We'll figure this out," he promised softly. "Whatever happened to your people, we won't let it happen to ours." Lyora didn't respond verbally, but her faint smile told him she understood. For the first time since their encounter, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. They were strangers from different worlds, bound together by tragedy. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way to prevent history from repeating itself. The next morning, the crew of Aurora's Reach returned to the derelict alien ship. Armed with new insights from Lyora's visions, they were determined to uncover more about her people and the catastrophe that had destroyed them. Captain Elias Venn led the team deeper into the vessel than they'd ventured before, guided by faint energy readings detected during their initial scans. The air inside the ship felt heavier now, charged with an almost electric tension. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Ensign Carter as he adjusted his scanner. "It's like it knows we're here." "Focus, Carter," Elias said sharply, though he couldn't deny the unease prickling at the back of his neck. The walls seemed to pulse faintly with light, and strange symbols etched into the metal glowed brighter as they moved forward. It was as if the ship itself was alive, watching their every step. Finally, they reached a massive chamber at the heart of the vessel. In its center stood a crystalline structure, towering and jagged, pulsating with an eerie blue light. The artifact hummed softly, emitting vibrations that resonated in their chests. It looked both beautiful and menacing, a relic of unimaginable power. "What is this thing?" Lieutenant Rourke asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. His voice carried a note of suspicion, but also awe. "I don't know," Dr. Patil admitted, her eyes wide with fascination. She approached cautiously, holding up her scanner. "But whatever it is, it's generating immense amounts of energy. Look at these readings. They're off the charts." As she spoke, the artifact reacted. Its glow intensified, and the hum grew louder, almost deafening. Suddenly, Lyora appeared in the doorway behind them. Her translucent skin flared brightly, and she staggered forward, clutching her head as if in pain. Her terrified gaze locked onto the artifact. "No, no," she whispered, though her words were unintelligible to most of the crew. Only Elias understood the raw fear in her voice. He rushed to her side, steadying her as she swayed unsteadily. "Lyora, what is it?" he asked urgently. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the artifact, shaking her head violently. Her glowing hands trembled as she pointed at the crystal, then pressed them against her temples, mimicking agony. Whatever the artifact was, it clearly caused her immense distress. "It's hurting her," Elias realized aloud, turning to the others. "We need to shut it down, or get her out of here." Before anyone could act, the artifact emitted a sharp burst of light. Everyone shielded their eyes instinctively, and when the glare faded, they noticed something alarming. Faint cracks had begun to form along the surface of the crystal, spreading outward like spiderwebs. A low, ominous rumble echoed through the chamber. "This isn't good," Carter stammered, backing toward the exit. "Something's happening." Dr. Patil studied her scanner again, her face pale. "The energy levels are spiking dangerously. If this thing overloads, we'll all be vaporized," Rourke finished grimly. Elias turned to Lyora, who was still trembling beside him. "Can you stop it? Do you know how it works?" Her response came not in words, but in another vision. Images flooded Elias's mind once more. Scientists in shimmering robes working around the artifact, their faces filled with excitement. Then came the explosion, a blinding flash of light that consumed everything. Lyora's memories made one thing clear: her people hadn't created the artifact. They'd discovered it, and in their attempts to harness its power, they'd unleashed destruction. "We have to leave," Elias ordered, grabbing Lyora's hand. "Now." The team scrambled toward the exit, but the artifact wasn't done with them. As they reached the corridor, the entire ship shuddered violently. Alarms blared, and the walls began to crack, revealing veins of glowing energy beneath the metal. The artifact was destabilizing, feeding off the very structure of the ship. "Run!" Rourke shouted, taking point as debris rained down around them. They sprinted through the collapsing corridors, dodging falling chunks of ceiling and bursts of energy. Lyora stumbled several times, her strength waning, but Elias kept her moving, refusing to let go. Behind them, the artifact's hum grew louder, more chaotic, until it became a deafening roar. When they finally burst back onto the Aurora's reach, the crew wasted no time sealing the airlock. Through the viewport, they watched in stunned silence as the alien ship imploded, consumed by a brilliant explosion of light. For a moment, the void of space shimmered unnaturally, as if reality itself had been torn apart. Back aboard their own vessel, everyone struggled to catch their breath. Lyra collapsed onto the floor, her glow dimmer than ever. She looked up at Elias, her expression a mixture of relief and despair. "What did we just witness?" Patel asked quietly, breaking the silence. Elias stared out the viewport, his jaw tight. Whatever that artifact was, it wasn't just a tool. It was dangerous, deadly. And I think it's the reason her world burned. As the crew processed what had happened, one question lingered in everyone's minds. If the artifact was so destructive, why had Lyora risked returning to the ship? What secrets did she still carry? And what other dangers might be lurking in the stars? The explosion of the alien ship left the crew of Aurora's Reach shaken but alive. As they drifted in the void, watching the remnants of the derelict vessel fade into cosmic dust, an uneasy silence settled over the bridge. The artifact's destruction had been catastrophic, yet its presence lingered like a shadow in their minds. What was it? Where had it come from? And why did Lyora react to it with such visceral fear? Captain Elias Venn sat alone in his quarters later that night, replaying the events in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling that they'd narrowly avoided disaster, and that Lyora had known far more than she let on. Her warnings, her visions, her desperate attempts to pull them away from the artifact, all pointed to one conclusion. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a guardian, carrying secrets too heavy for anyone to bear. But not everyone shared his perspective. In the briefing room the next morning, tensions flared as the senior crew debated their next steps. Lieutenant Rourke paced back and forth, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His usual stoic demeanor was replaced by barely contained frustration. "We're playing a dangerous game here," he said, his voice sharp. "That woman, Lyora, she led us straight to that thing. How do we know she didn't plan this? Maybe she wanted us to trigger it." Dr. Patel bristled at the accusation. "That's ridiculous, Rourke. She was terrified of the artifact. You saw how it affected her." "Exactly," Rourke shot back. "She acted like it was going to kill her, but maybe that's because she knew what it could do. For all we know, she's using us to escape responsibility for whatever happened to her people." Elias leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Enough," he said firmly, silencing both of them. "Speculation won't get us anywhere. We need facts, not accusations." Ensign Carter, who had been unusually quiet during the argument, finally spoke up. "What about the data we collected before the ship exploded? Could there be clues in the scans?" Patel nodded eagerly. "I've already started analyzing the readings. The artifact emitted energy patterns unlike anything I've ever seen. It's possible it wasn't even designed by her species. It might have been something older. Something alien to them too." Rourke scoffed. "Great. So now we're dealing with ancient space weapons. Fantastic." Despite his sarcasm, the idea sent a chill through the room. If the artifact predated Lyora's civilization, then its origins were even more mysterious and potentially more dangerous. But Elias couldn't ignore the bigger picture. They needed answers, not fear. Later that day, Elias visited Lyora in the observation chamber. She sat quietly on the floor, her glow fainter than ever. She looked exhausted, her luminous eyes clouded with sadness. When she saw him, she tilted her head slightly, as if asking if he still trusted her. "I need to understand," Elias said softly, kneeling beside the glass. "You showed me your world burning. Was that thing, the artifact, responsible?" Leora hesitated, then nodded slowly. She pressed her hand against the glass, and though no words passed between them, Elias felt her emotions surge: guilt, grief, and determination. She wasn't just a victim. She was trying to protect them. Back on the bridge, however, trust remained fragile. Unbeknownst to Elias, Rourke had taken matters into his own hands. Suspicious of Leora's motives, he ordered covert surveillance of her quarters, convinced she was hiding something. Late that night, he reviewed the footage alone in the security office. What he found shocked him. On the screen, Leora stood motionless in the center of her chamber. Her skin began to shimmer unnaturally, and faint symbols appeared around her body, glowing brighter with each passing second. Then, without warning, she raised her hands, and the symbols shot outward, embedding themselves into the walls. The cameras flickered, static filling the feed for several seconds before returning to normal. Rourke froze, his blood running cold. Whatever Leora was doing, it wasn't human or harmless. The next morning, he confronted Elias in private, showing him the footage. "You see this?" Rourke demanded, pointing at the screen. "She's manipulating our systems. If she can hack into the ship, what else is she capable of?" Elias frowned, torn between doubt and loyalty. Why would she risk exposing herself? She knows we're watching her. "Maybe she doesn't care anymore," Rourke replied grimly. "Or maybe she's planning something bigger." As the two men argued, neither noticed Leora standing silently outside the door, her glowing form dimmed to near invisibility. She had heard every word. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry. Instead, she turned and walked away, her resolve hardening. Whatever trust had begun to form between her and the humans was crumbling. The tension aboard Aurora's Reach reached a boiling point as Lieutenant Rourke's discovery cast a shadow of doubt over Leora. Captain Elias Venn found himself caught between two opposing forces, his growing trust in the alien woman and the mounting paranoia among his crew. The surveillance footage showed undeniable evidence that Leora had manipulated the ship's systems, but her intentions remained unclear. Was she a threat, or was there more to her actions than met the eye? Elias decided to confront her directly. He entered the observation chamber alone, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Leora stood near the far wall, her glowing skin dimmed to a faint shimmer. She turned to face him, her luminous eyes filled with sadness and resignation. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. "You've been hiding things from us," Elias said finally, his voice calm but firm. "Why?" Leora hesitated, then stepped closer to the glass separating them. She pressed her hand against it, her gaze locking onto his. Though no words passed between them, Elias felt a surge of emotion. Fear, guilt, and determination, all swirling together in a torrent he could barely comprehend. Then, slowly, images began to form in his mind. He saw her again on her homeworld, Sinara, standing alongside other scientists in a grand laboratory. The crystalline artifact loomed before them, its blue light pulsating rhythmically. Her people were studying it, trying to unlock its secrets. At first, their experiments seemed promising. They harnessed small amounts of its energy to power their cities, heal their sick, and advance their technology. But something went wrong. The vision shifted. The artifact's glow grew erratic, its hum turning into a deafening roar. Cracks spread across its surface, releasing waves of energy that destabilized the planet itself. Volcanoes erupted, oceans boiled, and the skies turned black with ash. Panic swept through Sinara as the entity within the artifact awakened, a monstrous force older than time, feeding on destruction and chaos. It consumed everything in its path, leaving nothing but ruin behind. When the vision faded, Elias staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared at Leora, understanding dawning in his eyes. That thing, it wasn't just a weapon. It summoned something, something alive. Leora nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She gestured toward the glass, her movements urgent. This time, when she projected her thoughts, they came through fragmented but clear enough for Elias to piece together. The beacon, he whispered, realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. The artifact wasn't the weapon. It was a signal, a call to whatever destroyed your world. Her expression confirmed his worst fears. The artifact hadn't been designed to unleash destruction directly. It had been created to summon an ancient, malevolent force. And now, thanks to their interference, the beacon had reactivated. "We have to stop it," Elias said, turning to leave. But Leora grabbed his arm, stopping him. Through another burst of mental imagery, she showed him the truth. The beacon's signal had already begun transmitting. Even if they destroyed it now, the damage was done. The entity would come for Earth. Elias sank onto the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of what she'd revealed. "How much time do we have?" he asked hoarsely. Leora shook her head, unable to answer. Time was slipping away, and there was no guarantee they could prepare in time. Meanwhile, tensions among the crew escalated. When Elias shared what he'd learned with Dr. Patel and Ensign Carter, they were horrified. But Lieutenant Rourke refused to believe it. "This is exactly what I warned you about," he snapped. "She's manipulating you, feeding you lies to buy herself time. We can't trust her." "She's not lying," Elias insisted, his voice rising. "Everything she's shown me matches the data we collected. The artifact wasn't just dangerous. It was calling something. Something worse. And how do you know she didn't plan this?" Rourke countered. "What if she's leading it straight to us?" Before Elias could respond, alarms blared throughout the ship. The crew rushed to the bridge, where flashing red lights illuminated grim faces. On the main view screen, a series of strange readings appeared. Energy spikes emanating from deep space, moving rapidly toward their location. "It's here," Dr. Patel murmured, her voice trembling. "Whatever the beacon called, it's coming." Elias clenched his fists, his mind racing. They had uncovered the truth, but it might already be too late. As the crew braced for the unknown, Leora stood silently in her chamber, watching the stars outside the viewport. Her heart ached with grief, but also with resolve. She had failed her people once, but she wouldn't fail humanity. Not if she could help it. The bridge of Aurora's Reach was a flurry of activity as the crew scrambled to prepare for the impending threat. The energy spikes on their sensors were growing stronger, moving closer with alarming speed. Whatever the beacon had summoned, it was no longer a distant danger. It was almost upon them. Captain Elias Venn stood at the center of the chaos, his mind racing as he tried to piece together a plan. But one thing was clear. They couldn't fight what they didn't understand. Dr. Patel worked furiously at her station, analyzing the incoming data. "It's massive," she said, her voice shaking. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than anything we've encountered. And it's accelerating." Ensign Carter glanced up from his console, his face pale. "What do we do, Captain? We can't outrun it." "We won't run," Elias replied firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at him. "We'll stand our ground and hope we're ready." Lieutenant Rourke, who had been unusually quiet since the alarm sounded, finally spoke. "Standing our ground is suicide. If that thing gets here, we're dead. Unless—" He trailed off, glancing toward the observation chamber where Leora waited. Elias caught the implication immediately. "No," he said sharply. "She's not responsible for this. She's trying to help us." "Is she?" Rourke challenged, his tone bitter. "Or is she just buying time until her friends arrive?" Before Elias could respond, Leora appeared in the doorway of the bridge. Her presence silenced the room. She stepped forward hesitantly, her glowing form dimmer than ever, as if her strength was fading. When she reached Elias, she placed a trembling hand on his arm and projected another vision into his mind. This time, the image was different. It showed a containment device, a spherical chamber surrounded by intricate patterns of light. Inside the sphere, the artifact's energy pulsed faintly, sealed away from the rest of the universe. Then the scene shifted, showing Leora herself standing inside the chamber. Her body began to glow brighter and brighter, until she dissolved into pure energy, merging with the artifact. The signal stopped. The entity vanished. When the vision ended, Elias staggered back, his heart pounding. You want to contain it using yourself?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Leora nodded solemnly, tears streaming down her cheeks. She gestured toward the crew, then pressed a hand over her chest, mimicking the act of sacrifice. "No," Elias said firmly, shaking his head. "There has to be another way. We can't ask you to." But Leora interrupted him, placing both hands on his shoulders. Through their connection, he felt her resolve, a deep, unshakable determination to make amends for her people's mistakes. She wasn't asking for permission. She was telling him what needed to be done. "She's right," Dr. Patel said quietly, breaking the silence. Everyone turned to look at her, surprised. If the artifact's energy can be contained, it might stop the signal and save Earth. But it requires a power source strong enough to stabilize it. Leora's physiology. She's the only one who can do it. Elias clenched his fists, torn between gratitude and grief. "And what happens to her?" Patel hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. She'll die. Her life force will merge with the artifact, sealing it forever." The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. No one spoke as the reality sank in. Leora was offering everything she had left, not just to protect humanity, but to redeem herself and her people. Finally, Elias turned to her, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back." Leora met his gaze steadily, her expression resolute. She nodded once, then placed a hand over her heart and bowed slightly, a gesture of finality. As the crew prepared the containment device, tensions ran high. Lieutenant Rourke still harbored doubts, muttering under his breath about trusting an alien. But even he couldn't deny the courage in Leora's actions. For the first time since their encounter, he looked at her not as a potential threat, but as someone willing to give everything for strangers. Hours later, the containment chamber was ready. Leora stood before it, her glow flickering faintly. She turned to face the crew one last time, her luminous eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. Then, without hesitation, she stepped inside. The door sealed shut behind her, and the machine hummed to life. Light poured from the chamber, growing brighter and brighter until it filled the entire room. Leora's form shimmered, dissolving into energy that merged with the artifact. The signal ceased abruptly, and the readings on the sensors dropped to 0. When the light faded, the chamber was silent. Leora was gone. Elias stared at the empty chamber, his throat tight with emotion. Though she was no longer there, her presence lingered in every corner of the ship, and in the hearts of those she had saved. The silence that followed Leora's sacrifice was deafening. The containment chamber stood motionless, its surface now dull and lifeless, a stark contrast to the radiant energy that had filled it moments before. Captain Elias Venn stared at the device, his chest tight with grief and awe. Though Leora was gone, her final act had sealed the artifact and silenced the beacon that had summoned the entity. But the crew knew their ordeal wasn't over yet. "Signals down," Dr. Patil announced, her voice trembling as she studied the readings on her console. Whatever was coming, it stopped moving. Ensign Carter let out a shaky breath of relief. "Does that mean we're safe?" "No," Lieutenant Rourke interjected sharply, his usual stoicism replaced by unease. "That thing could still be out there. Just because it stopped doesn't mean it's gone." Elias nodded grimly. "He's right. We don't know what we're dealing with, or if sealing the artifact will hold it back permanently. We need to stay vigilant. As the crew worked to assess the situation, strange phenomena began to plague the ship. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Lights flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows across the corridors. Crew members reported hearing whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Even the air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural tension. "It's like the ship's alive," muttered Carter, clutching his scanner tightly as he walked through the dimly lit halls. His wide eyes darted nervously at every sound, every movement in the periphery. Dr. Patel, too, noticed the changes. She ran diagnostics on the ship's systems, but found no logical explanation for the malfunctions. "It's almost as if something is testing us," she said during a brief meeting on the bridge. "Probing our defenses." Elias frowned, his mind racing. Could the entity still sense them? Had Leora's sacrifice only delayed the inevitable? Late that night, Elias returned to the observation chamber where Leora had spent her final days aboard the ship. The room felt empty without her, yet her presence lingered in the faint glow that still clung to the walls, a remnant of the symbols she had projected during her time there. He sat on the floor, staring at the glowing patterns, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Suddenly, the symbols began to shift. They pulsed faintly, forming shapes and images that danced across the walls. A vision flooded Elias's mind, not from Leora this time, but from something else. He saw the entity again, vast and incomprehensible, its form shifting like smoke and shadow. It loomed closer, reaching toward the ship with tendrils of darkness. Then came a surge of emotion. Anger, hunger, curiosity, all directed at him. Elias gasped, snapping out of the trance. His heart pounded as he realized what he'd seen. The entity wasn't just aware of them. It was drawn to their emotions, their fear, and it was getting closer. "We need to act fast," Elias told the crew the next morning. "Whatever's out there, it feeds on fear and chaos. If we lose control, it'll find a way in." Rourke frowned. "And how do you suggest we fight something we can't even see?" "We focus on staying calm," Elias replied firmly. "We work together. That's the only weapon we have left." Under his leadership, the crew implemented new protocols to maintain order. They conducted regular check-ins to ensure everyone remained grounded. Dr. Patel organized meditation sessions to help the crew manage their stress. Even Rourke softened slightly, offering words of encouragement when tensions ran high. But despite their efforts, the entity's influence grew stronger. Hallucinations plagued the crew, shadowy figures stalking the corridors, familiar voices calling their names. Some began to question whether they were truly alone on the ship. Then came the breaking point. One evening, Ensign Carter stumbled onto the bridge, pale and shaking. "I saw her," he stammered. "Leora. She was in the hallway." But it wasn't her. Her eyes. They were black. Before anyone could respond, alarms blared throughout the ship. The containment chamber had begun to destabilize. Cracks formed along its surface, leaking faint wisps of blue light. "It's breaking free," Patel shouted, panic creeping into her voice. Elias turned to the crew, his expression resolute. "This isn't over. Whatever happens next, we face it together." As the cracks spread and the hum of the artifact grew louder, the crew braced themselves for what might come. They didn't know if they could stop the entity, or if Leora's sacrifice would ultimately prove futile. But one thing was certain. They wouldn't give up without a fight. The containment chamber groaned ominously as cracks spread across its surface, glowing brighter with each passing second. Blue light seeped through the fractures, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the Aurora's Reach. The crew gathered around it, their faces pale and drawn, knowing they were running out of time. If the artifact broke free, the entity would be unleashed, and there was no telling what horrors awaited them. Captain Elias Venn stepped forward, his jaw clenched with determination. "We need to reinforce the containment field," he ordered. Patel, Carter, work on stabilizing the energy output. Rourke, secure the perimeter. Whatever happens, we can't let that thing escape. Dr. Patel nodded, her hands trembling as she adjusted controls at a nearby console. Ensign Carter joined her, his usual nervousness replaced by grim focus. Together, they worked feverishly to recalibrate the containment protocols, hoping to buy even a few more minutes. Lieutenant Rourke, meanwhile, moved through the corridors, ensuring every hatch was sealed and every system operational. But as he passed by a viewport, he froze. Outside the ship, the void of space seemed wrong. Shadows shifted where none should exist, twisting and writhing like living smoke. For a moment, he thought he saw eyes, cold, ancient eyes, staring back at him. "This isn't natural," he muttered under his breath, shuddering as he hurried away. Back in the containment room, the situation grew dire. The chamber's hum had turned into a deafening roar, and the cracks widened further. Faint whispers filled the air, overlapping voices speaking in languages no one could understand. It felt as though the entity itself was taunting them, feeding off their fear. "We're losing it," Patel cried, her voice breaking. "The energy levels are spiking too fast." Elias turned to Leora's glowing symbols still etched into the walls of the observation chamber. Something about them resonated with the artifact. They pulsed faintly in sync with its energy. An idea struck him. "Patel, can we channel those symbols into the containment field?" he asked urgently. "Maybe they'll stabilize it." Patel hesitated, then nodded. "It's worth a try. But I'll need help rerouting the power grid." "I'm on it," Carter said quickly, already moving to assist her. As they worked, Elias approached the containment chamber. He placed a hand on its cold surface, closing his eyes as memories of Leora flooded his mind. Her courage, her sacrifice, her unwavering resolve. It all came rushing back. He whispered softly, "We won't let you down, Leora. Your people will be remembered." Suddenly, the symbols on the walls flared brightly, responding to his words. Streams of light shot toward the containment chamber, merging with its fractured surface. The artifact's glow dimmed slightly, the cracks beginning to seal themselves. The whispers faded, replaced by an almost peaceful silence. "It's working," Patel exclaimed, relief washing over her face. "The symbols are stabilizing the field." But just as hope began to rise, the chamber shuddered violently. A loud crack echoed through the room, and a final burst of energy erupted from within. Everyone shielded their eyes as the light engulfed the space, blinding and intense. When the glare subsided, the containment chamber stood intact, but something had changed. The artifact inside was gone, replaced by a faint, pulsating orb of light. And in the center of the orb floated a translucent figure, Leora. She looked different now, stronger, more radiant. Her eyes glowed with a serene calm, and her expression carried a quiet sadness tinged with gratitude. She wasn't alive, not in the way humans understood life, but she lingered nonetheless, bound to the containment field she had sacrificed herself to create. Elias stepped closer, his heart aching. "Leora." Her lips moved silently, and though no sound escaped them, her message reached him clearly. "Thank you," she said, her voice echoing in his mind. "You gave me peace." Before anyone could respond, her form began to dissolve, scattering into tiny motes of light that drifted upward and vanished. The containment chamber fell silent once more, its purpose fulfilled. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of what they'd witnessed settled heavily over the crew. They had faced unimaginable danger, made sacrifices, and fought against forces beyond comprehension. And though Leora was gone, her legacy remained, a beacon of hope in the darkest of times. "She saved us," Carter murmured finally, breaking the silence. "All of us." Elias nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yes, and we'll honor her memory by doing what she couldn't, protecting this world." As the crew dispersed to repair the ship and prepare for their journey home, Elias lingered in the containment room. He stared at the now empty chamber. Months later, the Aurora's Reach returned to Earth, its journey marked by both triumph and loss. The crew had faced unimaginable dangers and emerged forever changed. As they descended through Earth's atmosphere, Captain Elias Venn stood on the bridge, staring out at the blue-green planet below. It looked peaceful from this distance, untouched by the horrors they'd encountered in the depths of space. But he knew better than anyone how fragile it truly was. The news of their discovery spread quickly after landing. Humanity buzzed with excitement and fear as reports of the alien artifact and the mysterious entity that nearly reached Earth dominated headlines. Governments convened emergency meetings, scientists debated theories, and ordinary people wondered if they were truly alone in the universe. Amidst the chaos, one story stood out: the tale of Leora, the alien woman who sacrificed herself to save a world she barely knew. Elias became an advocate for interspecies cooperation, sharing her story wherever he went. She didn't just warn us. He told crowds during speeches and interviews. She showed us what happens when curiosity turns reckless, when power is pursued without understanding its cost. Her sacrifice reminds us that we're not alone, and that our choices affect more than just ourselves. Dr. Patel dedicated her life to studying the containment chamber and the symbols left behind by Leora. Though the artifact itself was gone, the patterns etched into the walls held secrets about advanced energy manipulation and communication methods far beyond human comprehension. Her people weren't perfect, Patel often said, but they learned from their mistakes. And so must we. Lieutenant Rourke, once skeptical and distrustful, found himself reflecting on his own prejudices. Watching Leora give everything for strangers had shifted something deep within him. He began working with security teams to develop protocols for future encounters with extraterrestrial life, not based on fear, but on respect and caution. If she could trust us, he admitted privately to Elias one evening, then maybe we can learn to trust them too. Ensign Carter, inspired by Leora's courage, decided to pursue xenobiology as a career. He wanted to understand the vast diversity of life in the cosmos and ensure humanity approached it with humility rather than arrogance. She wasn't just an alien, he wrote in his first research paper. She was a teacher, a protector, someone who reminded us that even in the face of destruction, there's always hope. As time passed, memorials were erected in Leora's honor. Statues depicting her luminous form adorned parks and museums around the globe, accompanied by plaques bearing her final message: "Remember us." These words served as a reminder, not only of the tragedy that befell her people, but also of the responsibility humanity now carried to prevent such catastrophes. One evening, Elias visited a quiet park where one of these statues stood. Bathed in moonlight, it seemed almost alive, glowing faintly like Leora herself. He placed a hand on its base, closing his eyes as memories washed over him. Her tears, her visions, her unwavering resolve, they all felt so vivid, as though she were still beside him. "Thank you," he whispered softly, "for showing me what it means to truly protect something greater than myself." Though Leora was gone, her impact endured. She had bridged two worlds, teaching humanity lessons about unity, sacrifice, and resilience. In doing so, she ensured that her people would never be forgotten, and that Earth would tread carefully among the stars. Far above, in the infinite expanse of space, tiny motes of light drifted silently. They pulsed faintly, carrying fragments of a lost civilization's legacy, and perhaps somewhere in the vastness, a glimmer of hope for those who came next.